Okay, hello YouTube. In this video, I'm not going to analyze a whole lot of chess. I will go over one game, actually, very briefly. But for the most part, I want to give you kind of my opinion on something. I want to give you my opinion on the classical world champions and how we need to adjust this list and why I think it's wrong. So if you like content like this and want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and click on the notification icon. So this is the list of classical world champions. And if you don't know what the classical world champion is in chess, just like a lot of other sports that have like a classical world champion or a lineal world champion, the lineal world champion or the classical world champion is really the man that beats the man. So it's like you've got this guy that's the champion of the world, and then somebody beats him in a match, and then he loses that, then he has to play somebody, and eventually somebody beats him in a match, and so on and so forth, right? And we've had it happen on several occasions where a person was unable to play a match, right? Or they lost a match, or they refused to, defend their title. And then we determine the world championship, usually with like an international tournament or a candidates playoff, maybe followed by a final match against the top two competitors, and we get a world championship. We had that happen when Alexander Alekhine, passed away and was unable, to play a match against Mikhail Botvinnik, and then Mikhail Botvinnik became the world champion. We had that happen again when Bobby Fischer refused to defend his title in 1975, and then, of course, Anatoly Karpov became the world champion in 1975. We had that happen again recently when Magnus Carlsen refused to defend his title as well, and now we have Ding Liren as recognized as the 17th classical world champion. And because of this, because of the way that we determine the classical world champion, I think this list is absolutely wrong. And it's something that's bothered me, like, even since I was, 10 years old. Because once I saw this list when I was 10 years old that had the world champions going all the way back to Anderson. They actually included Anderson on the list. And what really bugged me about that was they didn't include Paul Morphy. So I think if you go back to Anderson, if you include Anderson, you have to include Morphy. But more importantly, I think it's completely fair to include Anderson. I see absolutely no reason why we should consider William Steinitz the first world champion of chess. And here's my reason why. So if you look at, Steinitz's, Wikipedia page, you go back to this first world champion, the official world championship match that he played, and you look at what they wrote about it. It was a match in 1886 that was played between Steinitz and Zukertort. And at Steinitz's insistence, the contract said it would be for the championship of the world. So this is self-declared. So William Steinitz self-declared that this would be for the championship of the world. But that's not how world championships work. You don't self-declare that this is for the championship of the world, and then we all just recognize it. World championships work, with a general consensus of who is the best player in the world, is this match being played between the two top players in the world, etc. Now, for that, I feel like you do need to go back to a previous match that Steinitz played. If you go all the way back to 1866 for his match against Anderson. So Anderson, who was regarded as the world's strongest active player because he had won the 1851 and 1862 London International tournaments. Okay, so Adolf Anderson was considered the world's strongest international player, strongest active player in the world, because he won these two tournaments, 1851 and 1862 international tournaments, and there was a match between Anderson and Steinitz, which Steinitz won. So I believe Steinitz actually became the world champion in 1866. And when he played that match against Zukertort, he wasn't becoming the champion of the world for the first time. He was defending his world championship that he won back in 1866. Now, the reason I think that Anderson is the world champion is because I believe that Anderson became the world champion in 1851. So if we go back to Anderson, this is part of Anderson's Wikipedia page, actually. If we go back to Anderson, we look at these two big international tournaments, and let me scroll to this one. There's the Morphy match here. We're getting to that. So the London 1851 tournament. So the first international tournament in London, Anderson was reluctant to accept the invitation, but he was travel costs. However, the tournament's principal organizer, Howard Stoughton, offered to play. Okay, so Anderson's preparation, etc., etc. So all the best players in the world were in the 1851, and then you can see this. I have this highlighted first here. The baton of the World Championship. He had said that the contest was for the baton of the World Championship, the London International Tournament. So this wasn't Anderson claiming that this was for the baton of the World Chess Championship. This was the tournament organizer. Okay, so this was the tournament organizer. This was this is the general consensus of the world. This was the strongest tournament in the world. It had the strongest chess players in the world, and the champion of this tournament was supposed to be considered the champion of the world in 1851. Well, what happens after 1851? After 1851, we have a match 7 years later in 1858 with the American Paul Morphy, which Paul Morphy won absolutely decisively. So Paul Morphy should be considered the second world champion in 1858 because he defeated Anderson, who was considered by everyone to be the best player in the world at the time. So we have this clear succession. Anderson, then Morphy. Then Morphy refuses to defend his title, basically. Morphy refuses to play chess. And then what happens? We have another major international tournament to determine the best player in the world. Who won this international tournament? Anderson won it. Anderson won the major international tournament in 1862, effectively getting his title back. And then he effectively lost that title in 1866 to William Steinitz. So we have this clear line of succession going all the way back to Anderson winning the international tournament back in 1851. It's very clean, it's very nice, it's very pristine. And, if you think about it, you can't just determine the world championship if it's going to be the man that beats the man, and it's going to be match play. Going all the way back to the very first world champion, it shouldn't be a match. The very first world champion should be determined by all the best players in the world getting together and playing a tournament to determine the best players in the world. We had that tournament. It was in 1851. So you can't have a match between Steinitz and Zukertort may or may not be the second best player in the world at the time. That's not an official world championship in my mind if you haven't had a previous one. Now, I think it is a world championship match, but I think Steinitz was the best player in the world, and he was simply defending his title against a challenger. I can accept that. Okay, and that's a perfectly reasonable way to look at it. But that means that the World Championship started back in 1851 when Anderson won the official tournament to determine who really the first official world champion that we should think of in classical chess should be. So there's been 19 classical world champions. So I have a second reason for wanting this. My second reason for wanting this is because when I go over games and I analyze games, I look at Morphy as kind of the father of all of modern chess in a lot of ways. He was the first player in the world that was really, really good. So like when I look at chess games and I go over chess games, I show tons and tons of Morphy games. Even when I talk about theory, when I go back and look at an opening historically, I often will show a bunch of Morphy games going all the way back to the 1860s. Because of this, I feel like it's really important that we recognize him as a world champion of chess. He added to the theory of chess. He added to our understanding of chess. And I really hate the idea that Steinitz is our first official world champion because as much as he added to the theory of chess in the way that he talked about chess, really, I don't show that many Steinitz games. I show one, basically. I'll show you. The only one that I end up showing is this one. This is Steinitz versus von Barthelman. It was called the Battle at Hastings. And what's interesting about this game is if you look at this game, and I'll just show it briefly, this game really was played almost in the style of Paul Morphy. It was this amazingly awesome sacrificial combination that he begun while keeping Barthelman's king in the center of the board. He masterfully kept his king in the center of the board by playing rook e1, and he pinned the knight to the king, and then he puts pressure on it, forces Barthelman to defend, gets all of his pieces to active squares, then sacrifices, almost Morphy style, and then brings his knight to e6. Like the whole game was almost played in the style of Morphy. Then he ends the game with a series of brilliant sacrifices. Rook e7, and of course rook f7, and rook g7, and rook h7, and actually some of this, the game had already ended. The guy had walked out of the room. So like right here, I think the guy walked out of the room instead of resigning. But the game would have continued, rook to h7, king g8, and this is really Steinitz's most famous game. Like all the coaches that I know that go over his games, this is the game that they show the most is this particular game, and they even go and show the end game even though the game didn't really end this way. So the one game that we show of Steinitz is like from 1895, and it's a game where Steinitz kind of plays in the style of Morphy. And one of the reasons we don't show a lot of other Steinitz games is because most of Steinitz games are riddled with so many tactical errors, it's very difficult to show them. And I will admit, Steinitz did add a lot to the theory of the game. He added a lot to our understanding. He added a lot of analysis and ideas and different ways to think about the center of the board. But as far as like being the most highly skilled player in the world, that's, Paul Morphy, he was amazingly highly skilled and incredibly accurate and showed us how to handle open positions for the very first time. Chess has got to start there. It's got to start there, and it's got to start with him beating Anderson, who was considered the best player in the world starting in 1851. And even Anderson, I show more Anderson games than I show William Steinitz games. So I think going all the way back to Anderson, Anderson's the first world champion, then Morphy, then Steinitz, and I think that's much better. And I think it's better when we try to show people the history of the game and when we go over games and when we're going over all these Paul Morphy games and we somehow have to say, oh, but Paul Morphy was never the world champion. But really he was. And I just feel like that's wrong. We need to start recognizing him as the second world champion. And we have 19 classical world champions, not 17. Anyways, that's just my opinion. Hopefully it catches on like wildfire. But, I'm sure I might get a lot of hate in the comments for people that don't want to change the list. Anyways, thank you very much for watching. I hope I didn't cause too much controversy. Let me know what you think in the comments. And anyways, if you like this channel, please check out some of my other stuff. I do a lot of cool stuff on openings, endgames, and all kinds of other things. Hopefully you can watch it and tell me what you think. I hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you very much for watching.